Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Streaming Alchemy Show, albeit a fairly delayed version of the show. Uh, for those who had tried to connect with us before for our 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time show, uh, we ended up having a bit of internet connectivity issues where the stream would start and then we'd lose bandwidth and it would drop immediately. So we ended up, we did a run through for the show, but we really decided that doing this show live is really the important aspect of it. So even though this is fairly late, it's 5:50 now instead of 2 p.m. Uh, hopefully, if you're able to join us, that would be fantastic, and we can interact with you. Uh, on today's show, we're going to be taking a look at lenses. There's a lot of core detail that goes into working with the lenses, whether they're separate lenses that are part of a detachable lens system for a camera, to built-in lenses and everything from your phone up to great PTZ cameras that are available out there. So we think it's really important that we cover some of these foundational elements and move forward from there as a primer on how you work with lenses. Uh, so before we get started with the show, I want to remind everybody that even though it's delayed, we will be taking call-ins. So if you would like to join us on air, you can please go to the URL listed here. And it also should be a link right at the top of the show notes where we're streaming this production now. So I guess as we look at lenses, the thing to appreciate is that lenses really are everywhere. So everybody has a phone in their pocket in all likelihood. And, there are plenty of DSLRs and mirrorless cameras out there, as well as, lots of people using PTZs like the PTZ optics here. Uh, all of the lenses across the board, whether they're detachable phone or, built into a camera, all share very similar properties and attributes that you can leverage to create more interesting and compelling shots for your live streams. So, the first thing that I'd really like to talk about as we look at lenses is something called focal length. So, if you look inside of a lens, you basically have multiple elements inside a lens. So a lens isn't really just one piece of glass, but it's multiple pieces of glass that are moved back and forth in relationship to each other to focus an image. And when you look at how they focus, these lens elements actually focus to what is typically called an optical center of the lens. It's where all of the light rays will converge when an image is being projected onto the camera sensor. So when we talk about focal length, uh, it is the distance. Let me just see. Yep. Sorry, let me jump back here. It is the distance between the optical center of a lens and the image sensor in a camera. But when you look at this, what you know it more as are the millimeters number on a lens. So you see this lens is 24 millimeters or 50 or 100 millimeters. And that's really how wide an angle or how telephoto a lens is, how much it zooms out or zooms in the way we tend to think of these types of things for a lens. So when you look at focal length, what you really will have now is you'll have a camera with a lens pointed at a subject. And that image will bounce light off into the lens, and that lens will focus it on the optical center, and it actually will project it onto the sensor inverted. So the bottom is the top, and the top is the bottom. So that's really the way lenses work in almost all uh, modern cameras today. So one of the things you'll notice, though, is when you have this, there is a certain width to the height of the image and the horizontal breadth of the image. And that's called your field of view. So often the height is called the vertical field of view and the width is called the horizontal field of view. So this really says how big an image am I getting? How wide is the image that I'm focusing in on? So If, though, I increase the focal length, so if I increase where this point here is in a lens system, what you're going to end up now is narrowing your field of view. So you're not going to have the same vertical or horizontal width you had. And this is really intuitively what we expect. When I zoom in a lens, it moves me closer to the subject and effectively cuts a lot of the image that I was seeing at a wider view away from the scene. So now I see a much tighter image on a much more focused area inside of uh, the space I'm recording. So this gives me now an ability to understand how, when you want to work with the lens, how you're going to actually move through different spatial dimensions by zooming in and zooming out. And it's really all because you're changing that that focal length, which is at its heart the basis for how you understand how close a camera can get or how far away a camera can get from a subject. So the other piece, which is really critical besides focal length, is something called aperture. Now, when you look at aperture, you're really looking at, these are called an iris in a camera. It is the first element in a lens. So it's the lens, it's the doorway to the lens that lets light in to move through the lens elements and onto the sensor. So what you have now is different widths of openings that you can have. So larger apertures and much smaller apertures. And the main difference here, it's the amount of light they let in. But there's a lot of implications to that as well. So one of the ways that people measure the amount of light that something lets in, a lens lets in, is what's called an f-stop. So the thing about an f-stop is it's not a fixed size, but it's actually a ratio. So the first thing you're using is you're using the diameter of the aperture. So what's the width across of the opening in the aperture? But you're using that to divide the focal length. So in this case, since this is a picture of a lens which is 50 millimeters focal length and a 1.4 f-stop, this means that the diameter of the aperture is almost 36 millimeters. And that's fairly wide, when you're starting to look at the typical lenses. Now, if I were to double the focal length, if I wanted to zoom in on something, what you're going to find now is that unless I can start to make this diameter even wider, I'm going to end up lowering my f-stop. And what that means is that as I zoom in, if I don't have a wider aperture setting that I can go to, I'm going to be stuck at a higher f-stop, letting less light in than I was before. So this can have a big implication for how an image looks when it hits the image sensor. So let's take a little look, because the place, there's a few things that will impact this. And so the first one is focus. And let me sort of talk about this. As you move light through a system, the light is going to bounce off of a single point, and it's going to be projected through the lens system and onto the sensor. So where these lights converge, this point that you're dealing with down here, where you have a convergence right on the lens, that would make focus really good. So you'd have a very clear image. But if you shifted the focus, let me just go here, a little bit to either side, where you moved it in or out, you'd be more out of focus than before. And this is really because of the way lights converge. If you have these lights all converging and they're not at that focal point where everything is coming together on the sensor, then you have multiple light rays that aren't quite lined up that are now hitting the sensor. And that can be because it's either focused after where the sensor is or just before. And it creates issues with what actually is projected. And that comes in as an out of focus image. But the other piece to this, and this is really where the aperture comes into play, The other piece to this is something called depth of field. Now, people sometimes use this term to mean they want a shallow depth of field. They want to see everything that's behind a subject blurry, and just the subject of a video, in focus. So, but depth of field, in its general use of the term, is just the amount of space before and after a subject that is in acceptable focus. Now, this is an interesting point. When you deal with lenses on a mathematical level, there is a single plane that is in focus. So if I have an image that is bouncing light, there is one point where that image is in focus in my camera, and then other points along that curve where it's not, but it's close enough. So you could look at it and aesthetically say, I can see everything with enough clarity that I feel good about the image. And it is a soft feeling like that. It isn't some hard, fast number. So when you're looking at depth of field, what you really are looking at is, where do those lines get drawn? At what point does it stop being acceptable? So if you look at this picture here, we have light with a very wide aperture. In this case, this would be similar to the 1.4 the f1.4 that we were looking at before. We have a very wide aperture, and so there's a lot of light that's entering the lens. But the thing about light is it's coming in from all different angles. So when it hits the lens, all of these different angles, the lens trying to focus it into a single point and project it onto the sensor. But it's very difficult because lights at different angles don't really converge cleanly. And so there is still that one absolute center of focus. But as you move away from that, these lights coming in at all different angles create less clarity. And so when you have a very wide aperture, you let a lot of light in, but you also end up with something where the depth of field is very shallow. So there's only a very small part of an image which is solidly and acceptably in focus, and then everything else just starts to blur. Now, if I were to shrink the aperture and go to a higher f-stop, what's going to happen when that light comes in is a lot of the light that was coming in at these odd angles is going to get blocked because now the aperture is a lot smaller. And so it's letting less light in. But there's a plus side to this. Even though the image now is going to be darker, it has less light to work with, the rays of light that are coming in are going to be more focused. They're going to be closer in alignment and more converged. And that means that you can move further in front and behind a subject without becoming too out of focus. And so you have a deeper depth of field when you have a smaller aperture because the light that's making it through is more clearly aligned and converged and creates a cleaner image when it hits the sensor and on both sides of it. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how depth of field plays into this. But if you want to look at it more directly, here's something we set up where we have these two bobbleheads. So we have our Steve Jobs in the front and Elon Musk in the back. And we took this picture at f22, but with ISO 8000. So what this means, the higher the ISO, it means we're asking the camera to enhance the image, to add more artificial light. So it amplifies the light, but it also amplifies the noise. So the image is a little noisier, but it's also much lighter and more visible. But at f22, you can see that the bobblehead in the front is in good focus, but the bobblehead in the back is actually just a bit out of focus, but still very clear and legible. So let me go through here. If I look at the next image, I now went to an f16. So I opened the aperture up, let a little bit more light in, and I have a lower ISO, so lower noise. And what you're starting to see now is that the bobblehead in the back is getting a little blurrier. And so if I sort of run through this now at f11 and f8, each one of these incrementally, while lowering the ISO, is also creating a shallower depth of field. So now, even though these two figurines were probably, about 16 inches apart when we took the pictures, you can now see that the image in the back is becoming significantly more blurred, even though the overall image is becoming cleaner because there's less gain being applied to it. So now this is f2.8, which is the lowest f-stop we had available on the lens we were using. And you can see now that the figurine in the back is pretty much fully blurred. Uh, you can still make it out as a figure, but the thing is, it's no longer distracting. Your eye isn't drawn to that. And that's really the point when you're using depth of field in a production. You want to make sure that you're using it to focus somebody's attention on what's important in the scene that you're filming. And this can be really valuable if you're doing something, say, at a trade show, where there's a lot of activity going on all around you, but you still want to do an interview with somebody and stream that out, through something like Live View or whatever. You want to create a shallow enough depth of field that all the noise that's going on around you and all the hubbub and people moving are not distracting. And depth of field gives you something which does this while still being pretty much aesthetically pleasing. People look at it and they feel comfortable with the image. It's a normal way that they feel they can focus on what's important. So depth of field is very powerful. And as we were talking about, it really is a question of setting the aperture right and, setting your focal length right. So these two things sort of work together to create focus and depth of field. And it's very, very useful when you're trying to leverage it for that, especially in live situations. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is the different types of lenses that are available. One type is prime lenses, and you may have heard this term. Simply put, a prime lens is a lens with one focal length. So in this case, this lens here has a 50 millimeter focal length. So everything that you think about with a zoom lens, this is nothing there. This, you plug it in and you got 50 millimeters, and all you can really do is you can control the aperture setting, or you can control and you can control the focus. So this is one style of lens. The other, of course, is the one that people are very familiar with called a zoom lens or a telephoto lens. And this allows you to run through a range of focal lengths. So in this case, this lens is a 50 to 100 millimeter zoom lens. What makes this interesting is that when you have a prime lens, the lens itself, the mechanisms inside the lens, are actually much simpler. So if you know you're going to be taking shots that are at a fixed distance and with it using a fixed focal length, you can get a better lens in the prime family for lower cost. So, for every dollar you spend, you'll get a better image into your camera if you can live with it being one focal length. The zoom lens, on the other hand, to get an equivalent image, it will cost you much more, but in that you're buying flexibility. So if I'm doing an interview and I have to rearrange things and reposition it, I can simply just, zoom in or zoom out to make whatever adjustments I need. And that will, be really handy. There's lots of situations where, especially when you're live streaming in an environment that's outside your studio, having that ability to make those types of adjustments can be invaluable and save your bacon as you have to move things at the last minute to make a shot work. So I think, this is really a choice of what works best for you. And what I found is there are a lot of folks who will buy a couple of prime lenses for the focal length they use all the time, repetitively. And then they'll buy a couple of zoom lenses to cover sort of that area in between. If I need to do a special shot or I need to do more run and guns type streaming, you can do that with a zoom lens, and that would work very well for you. So the other thing when you think about zoom lenses, though, it has to deal with focus. So there are two types of zoom lenses when you look at focus. One are called parfocal, and the other are called varifocal. Now, a parfocal lens keeps the focus of the lens throughout the entire zoom range. And what this means is that if I were setting up, say, a news shot with somebody, and I was going to do a live news stream, I could zoom all the way into the person, go full telephoto, adjust focus now that I'm looking at them with a lot of detail, a lot of little edges that I can really pull a very crisp focus on. And when I have that dialed in, I can adjust the focal length to reframe the shot correctly, the way I want to use it in the actual interview, and the focus will stay perfect to that entire zoom range. So it doesn't matter now that I made an adjustment to focal length, the zoom is still good. Varifocal, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. Every time I make an adjustment to focal length, I need to go and make an adjustment to focus. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is cost. Parfocal lenses are much more expensive than varifocal lenses. But the other piece is really to do with the way people use lenses today. Most telephoto lenses that people use are autofocus lenses. And autofocus has become incredibly good. I mean, on some systems, it's as good as you would get, manually focus pulling for most of the shots you'd need to take if you were really just interested in a plane in focus. Uh, in order to do autofocus, you need to have servos inside that can drive the focus rings and move the lens elements. And the only way to do that is to make those lens elements fairly loose. So when the camera is sort of hunting for focus and moving the elements in and out, you don't need a very powerful servo to do that. You can do it with a very low power servo. So it becomes very difficult to create autofocus lenses that are parfocal because the rigidity that's usually part of a parfocal system doesn't play well with the typical autofocus mechanics that are available today. So there's a good reason why. But the key point from this, and this is especially true for people who use PTZ cameras, put them on autofocus. Almost every PTZ camera you're going to use is going to be varifocal. And because of that, every time you go to a new preset, which may zoom in or out from a particular scene and cut a new angle, you're going to need to make sure that that focus is set. And the only way to do that really is through autofocus on these cameras. So as you think of this, always make sure that that's something you have set and is part of the sort of your normal startup checklist for every live stream you do. Now, the other element, this is an interesting one, and it's really important to understand because otherwise it can get very confusing when you look at cameras and what their lenses are actually going to deliver. When we've talked about focal length, we also talked about field of view. What the crop factor is, though, is it's a way to look at field of view for different sensor sizes. So when you think of a field of view, what you're typically describing is how wide a field of view I would get with this focal length on a full frame sensor, which is really the standard film sensor that was used historically. And so this is the sort of thing where people's understanding of what these focal lengths meant, what sort of image they would capture, were all driven around these full frame sensors. But in reality, most cameras are not full frame. There's, the APS-C Super 35. There's Micro Four Thirds. PTZ cameras like the PTZ Optics is about a 1/3 inch sensor. So when you look at this, you actually have to make an adjustment based on the size of the sensor for how wide a field of view you'd get. Now, if you think about this, the way we worked this with field of view was that it's the angle from the top and bottom of the sensor through the optical sensor of the lens. So if that sensor's smaller, what you're actually doing is you're narrowing that field of view. And what the crop factor is, it's telling you what multiplier do you use. It's that I will take these numbers you see here and I will multiply them by 5.5 to understand what is the real field of view I'm going to get from this camera when it's all the way zoomed out and all the way zoomed in compared to what I would expect on a full frame sensor camera. So if you look at this, what this is really telling me is I have a 24 millimeter full frame equivalent lens on the wide side, and I have a 480 millimeter full frame equivalent lens on the telephoto side. So that's an incredible breadth. I mean, so what you get with this camera is